Well, welcome to another Friday night. One of the things that I find myself doing periodically is taking us back to some basic stuff around complex trauma. So complex trauma is what we teach about all the time, but I think it's helpful at times to just go back to the basics and say, okay, let's just make sure we got this again. And so recently I find that a lot of people have asked me, what's the difference between PTSD and CPTSD? Or what's the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD? Both designations are out there. And so that's what I want to talk about tonight, and I just hope it gives you some clarity, and I don't just want to make a distinction between PTSD and CPTSD. I want you to see that there's an overlap, but there's also differences. And when it comes to healing PTSD versus healing CPTSD, there's an overlap, but there's also differences. And so it helps people understand why we do what we do at React and Lift, because we're dealing with complex PTSD, complex trauma, and PTSD, there's a little bit of a difference. So that's what we're going to look at tonight, and I hope it just helps you. And we're going to do some things over the next couple weeks to just further help you get a clear understanding of the differences. So let me begin with PTSD. So post-traumatic stress disorder really became popular with war veterans and all of their shell shock and stuff like that. So it's related to big T trauma, if you want to think of it that way. One event trauma that was so horrific, so overwhelming, dangerous, that it just traumatized the person. So PTSD is big T trauma, one-time event. So what happens is the brain adapts in that kind of danger. The adaptation is it goes to fight or flight or freeze. All about survival. It adapts to survive. Once the danger has passed, the brain goes back to the pre-adaptation tools for living. So before the big T trauma, it was using certain tools. Trauma hit, brain adapts, fight, flight, freeze, danger passes, goes back to the pre-trauma tools. It doesn't change the behavior in an ongoing way. It goes to the previous normal behavior. Okay? But then you're said to have PTSD if there's ongoing effects from that trauma. And so those ongoing effects would be flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive memories regarding that event. Avoidance. Now you just avoid certain places, certain events. You don't want to talk about it. Third, you have trouble sleeping. You have trouble concentrating because it keeps intruding the event, the memory. Fourth, there's a hypervigilance. You're now more alert when you're in certain places. And then for many with PTSD, they find they have mood swings. They have trouble regulating their emotions. And now they deal more with depression and anxiety as ongoing issues for them in their life. And then the final one is that if there's something that triggers the memory of that trauma, they quickly dysregulate. They escalate 0 to 100 in a nanosecond. So they have a heightened startle response and dysregulated emotions. So that would be how they would define a person with PTSD if they have those ongoing symptoms. Okay, so let's go to complex PTSD. So the difference is instead of a one-time event danger, it's ongoing danger. So the person is surrounded day by day in an environment of danger. So that could be because of two things. The obvious one is they have multiple big T events. So almost every day there's another big T trauma event. Dad beats up mom. Dad beats up the kids. Dad throws things. Dad gets angry. There's all kinds of danger, deep danger, abuse every day. That's ongoing big T events create complex trauma. But there's a second, and it's a more subtle, mild type of trauma, but just as much trauma. And that is when a child lives in an environment of neglect, where their certain needs are not met consistently by the caregivers. So physical needs might be not consistently met, but emotional needs are not consistently met. Or the child isn't able to connect to the parents because the parents are too busy. They're workaholics. They have their own mental health issues. So the child is trying to connect but can't and feels all alone. And so that makes them feel fear. It's just me against the big bad world, the ones that I look to for comfort and safety I can't connect with, or they're too busy. And so that is a type of complex trauma, because the child feels in danger because they feel alone. So those are the things that create complex trauma. Then the response to that trauma is an activated stress response system. So with one-time trauma, big T trauma, PTSD, the stress system was activated, fight, flight, freeze, and then it was unactivated. Okay? Complex trauma, the stress system remains activated because I am in trauma or danger all the time. So cortisol is pumping all the time. Adrenaline is pumping all the time. My sympathetic nervous system is going all the time. And my parasympathetic nervous system can't get in there because of the ongoing danger. And so the stress system is constantly activated, but then it overreacts to every new little danger, stress, or problem. So that is the result of living in constant danger. But that's not the only thing. And this now is where it differs from one-time event trauma, from PTSD. Because when you live in ongoing danger, not only do you have an activated stress response system, but you begin to adapt, not just fight, flight, freeze, but you're doing fight, flight, freeze in every part of life. And it's not just you do it once and then go back to healthy behaviors. The adaptations become your way of life. They become your behaviors. So now you lie. You don't trust people. You wear masks all the time. You're a control freak. All because that's what you need to do to survive in an ongoing way. So those adaptations become how you live. But the problem is, those were good for one-time safety things, and then you could go back to being honest, to being loving. But when that's your way of life, and that's your adaptations become your way of life, they present problems in adult life. Because now you lie, it messes up relationships. Now you're a control freak, you damage your kids. Now you wear masks all the time, nobody can have intimacy or connect with you. So your adaptation to survive has become a maladaptation. And that is a huge difference between complex PTSD and PTSD, is the adaptations remain but are maladaptive. The fourth thing is that when you live in danger all the time, you start to believe lies. Because the danger makes you think that what's happening to you and what you're concluding about life is the truth in general about life. So let me show you what happens here. If you're neglected or abused, you try to connect to your parents, but they're too busy. the child says, it's my fault. And they develop the belief about their identity that is a lie. And it is shame. It's I must not be lovable. I must not have value. So there's a lie that comes out of complex PTSD. Next one. In a healthy home, a child realizes that if you want to connect, you are authentic. And then you connect. What happens in complex PTSD? The child is authentic and then they get punished for that. They get made fun of. They get judged. Nobody wants to connect with them if they're authentic. And so they, in their mind, believe authenticity equals zero connection. They don't have the necessary experience to know that authenticity with safe people equals connection. In their mind, authenticity always equals no connection. Another lie. And then in complex PTSD, everybody that a child naturally trusts has hurt them and let them down. And so they have developed a belief that says people can't be trusted. And so they go into adult life believing people can't be trusted, and that messes up relationships. And then for many in complex PTSD, if they had needs and expressed needs, they were considered to be selfish. And so they began to believe that having needs is being a selfish person. And so now they can't even express needs today because they feel that would be selfish. So hundreds and hundreds of lies come out of complex PTSD that a person with just simple one-time big T PTSD trauma wouldn't have. So let me just summarize that. Complex PTSD, there are ongoing effects. So there's the similarities to PTSD. You all get the flashbacks, the memories, the hypervigilance, the triggers. But then there's the lies and beliefs. Then there's the maladaptive ways of coping. And so what I want you to see from that is complex PTSD programs our subconscious brain with faulty beliefs, faulty ways of behaving, coping, relating to others. So that now our autopilot is unhealthy. So that as we go into adult relationships, as we deal with adult stresses, our autopilot takes us to maladaptive ways that do damage to ourselves and others. Another way to say that is complex PTSD affects every part of what makes me a human in a negative way. PTSD doesn't do that. So complex PTSD, it affects my brain and how it develops. It affects my immune system. It affects my mental health. It affects my emotional world. It affects how I cope. It affects how I think. It affects everything in a negative way. So what I hope you can see is that dealing with PTSD is going to be challenging, but it's going to be a lot easier and quicker than dealing with complex PTSD. Because complex PTSD takes the issues of trauma to changing a person at a deep level negatively. And so there's going to be a lot more work that needs to be done. And so let me just explain the therapy for PTSD versus CPTSD. Mainly when you have therapy for PTSD, big T trauma, one-time event trauma, it's all about reprocessing the event and learning to regulate your emotions, okay? So again, it's important to understand that our brain processes from the bottom up. So from the brain stem to the limbic brain and then the cortex. And so when we go through an experience, the first thing that processes it is the brain stem, which compares it to past experiences that it has memories of. And it evaluates, is this dangerous or safe? If it's dangerous, then it reacts. And then you get that dysregulation that takes place. So what has to happen then in therapies is I have to help people learn to regulate the brain stem and the limbic brain when they get triggered. And so EMDR, DBT, CBT, grounding, cognitive processing therapy, EFT or tapping, emotional healing, exposure therapy, all of those are around helping people regulate the limbic brain and the brain stem, helping them reprocess the memory. So important, so necessary, and it can be very difficult, painful as a person begins doing that, but as they stick at it, they begin to experience this healing, this reprocessing, so they're not getting as triggered as much, they're not dysregulating as much. What about CPTSD? So understand this. You're going to use all of those PTSD therapies as well with people with CPTSD. You're going to use EMDR, CBT, DBT. All of that is going to be very helpful because they need to learn to regulate the brain stem and limbic brain as well. They're going to get triggered and they need to learn how to de-escalate. That is so important, but it can't stop there. Because remember, CPTSD does damage much deeper. So there has to be beginning to identify the lies that I have believed and changing that and understanding the truth about life and about happiness and about relationships. But more than that, I then have to understand all of that subconscious programming of all my maladaptive coping strategies, and I have to bring that to a conscious level so that I begin to understand my patterns, what triggers those old behaviors, triggers using those old tools, and then I have to learn what does healthy look like and what tools help me become healthy, and I have to learn those new tools. And what you can realize is that's going to take a lot of time. You don't just do that in a month or so. That is a massive amount of work to get through all of that. And then on top of that, you need a surrogate family. You need a healthy support network because you can't learn all of that deep stuff and get through it alone. So CPTSD takes a lot longer. And it doesn't just deal with the brain stem and the limbic brain. It is about totally rewiring the cortex, getting rid of the lies. It is about understanding all the old behaviors, all the triggers of those behaviors, changing those behaviors. So, here's what I have seen as a therapist. A lot of people come in with complex trauma, and they want to just use a PTSD strategy. So I'm going to do EMDR, or I'm going to do stuff that helps me regulate my emotions when I'm escalated. And they go and they do those therapies and they feel better. And what the danger is they think, oh, I'm healed. That's all I need to do. But if that's all they do, and they think that's a magic bullet that has now cured them, but they don't realize all the deeper faulty programming in their subconscious, all the lies, they're going to go back out into life and they're going to feel better for a little while. But as they get triggered by the stresses of life, they're going to go back to the old programming, to the old beliefs. And it's going to undo all the progress they saw from using that PTSD therapy. So for people with complex PTSD, yes, use the PTSD therapies. In the beginning, they're so helpful, but don't stop there. Go further and begin to understand the lies you believe and all the maladaptive ways of coping. If you don't, you will, and you stop with the PTSD, you're going to find it'll work and help for a while, but then you'll regress. Now, I want to just stop here and take you in a little different direction to think about complex PTSD. I get a lot of people that would come into React or Lift, And they would say, all of my problems in life started when I had a big T trauma event. I was in a car accident, my spouse divorced me, my child died. That's when my addiction stuff happened. That's when my life fell apart. And I go, okay, I can see definitely that would have really affected you negatively and been very, very difficult to go through. But here's what I want you to understand. If a child who grew up in a very healthy home, who had all kinds of loving support and healthy tools, went through those big T events, they wouldn't have gone into drugs and alcohol. They wouldn't have gone down the road that you went down, because they would have used their tools to deal with that in a healthy way. So the fact that you had maybe an okay home growing up, but when that big T trauma hit, it exposed weaknesses in you where you didn't have the tools to handle certain things, and then you went down fight, flight. And you went into drugs and alcohol and those behaviors. So what I want you to consider is, yes, big T trauma triggered you going into fight or flight, but you were set up from earlier in life where you didn't have adequate tools for a big T trauma, but you didn't know it because you didn't have a trauma then, and you looked like you were a fairly healthy person, but the big T trauma exposed the weaknesses of your toolbox. So you had pre-existing vulnerabilities based on your upbringing. Those might be very subtle, but they're important to think about. So let me give you a way to understand complex trauma. The very, very subtle types of complex trauma are anything in your family that wasn't a healthy tool, or you weren't given a healthy tool. You didn't get your needs met properly. You weren't connected to properly. That causes weaknesses in you, so that when big T trauma comes, then it exposes those weaknesses and it takes you into fight, flight. So not anything unhealthy in a home creates a vulnerability in a child that could set them up to fail if a big T trauma comes. So let me give you some examples. So I want you to think of a home that was, on the outside looking at it, it looked like a perfect family. They were always having fun together. They were a very moral family, very religious family. When you saw them, they were always happy. They were always doing things together. But as you went in and looked at the family, they had all kinds of healthy things as part of their family, but they had a few things missing. Number one, the children weren't allowed to think for themselves. They weren't allowed to share all of their emotions. They had to be happy all the time, and they had to agree with Dad. So they basically thought Dad's thoughts. What Dad said was right, they had to adopt. They couldn't challenge that. So that was there. Then it was a family that had a lot of great stuff, but deep down their value was money, being rich, having a very prominent position in society, and looking good with a good body. So that was put into the children. And then there was a lot of shame in the family. Dad would never admit that deep, deep down, he didn't like himself. He didn't feel worthy of love or value. He tried to overcompensate and become narcissistic and be, I'm better than everybody. I think I'm great. That was his way of dealing with his shame, denying it and overcompensating. And then there was a lot of fear motivation used within the family. You can't do that because this might happen. You can't do that because this might happen. You better watch out about going there because that might happen. Fear, fear, fear was the primary way of motivating the children. And then there was subtle spiritual abuse. So the ultimate way of motivating children to do what is right is say, God will be angry at you. God's going to judge you. So God now became the big fear person to be afraid of as motivating. So what I want you to see is on the surface, this family looks quite healthy. And all the children seem to be doing quite well. But then a big T trauma hit that family. And the kids all went into negative places. Why? And I'm going to show you in a minute. Because they didn't have certain tools. Let me give you another example. This is also going to be a very moral, religious family that for much of what it did was quite healthy, but there were a few deficits. It was a family that had fairly good boundaries, but not perfect boundaries, because they believed that if you love people, you never said no to them. So if somebody phoned you and you're busy with your kids, well, you have to talk to that person and your kids get neglected. So there were some boundary issues. And then they didn't give the kids great tools for dealing with stress. So when stressful situations came along, they didn't talk about it. They didn't do very practical things. You just buried it. You just pushed harder, dug deeper. You didn't show that you were struggling. You didn't take time to care for yourself, because that would be considered selfish or being lazy. You just had to work, push. And then it was a family that was very emotionally stoic. You didn't show a lot of emotions. You always had to be under control emotionally. Then in raising a child, the emphasis wasn't on nurture and hugs and doing lots of warm things with the children. It was on discipline, strict rules and discipline. So again, so much in that family was wonderful. But there are a few tools that were missing. There are a few things that weren't as healthy as they could have been. And they set the children up for some troubles later in life. Let me give you another example. This family, zero religion, but yet a very good family in many ways. But mom's stress eats. When mom's feeling stressed, she goes to food. Dad, he was great at connecting with the kids when they were little. He was fun. He played with them. But as they got into their teen years, Dad wasn't so good at connecting with the kids anymore. Dad loved to have weekend parties where there's lots of drinking and suggestive sexualized talk and behavior. And weekends were party times. And then Dad had his own private stash of pornography. Boundaries were kind of lax once the kids got older. You kind of do what you want. Nobody's going to hold you accountable for stuff. And then it was a family where let's just have fun. Let's do lots of stuff together. Let's have great holidays together, but nobody talked deeply about anything or anything too personal. So 3 families, lots of good stuff in each family, but each family had a few weaknesses, a few things that weren't healthy. And you know, for all of them, if they had gone through a fairly easy life, they probably would have looked like they were super healthy, like they were coping great with life. Nobody saw the cracks in the foundation. But when a big T trauma hit, they didn't have the tools to deal with stress. They didn't know how to think for themselves. They didn't know how to talk about deep stuff. They didn't know how to reach out for help. They didn't know what to do with that. And so they went to fight, flight, freeze, and went into unhealthy behaviors that looked like they had complex trauma for years. And so all of the cracks in the foundation were exposed by the big T trauma. And that is what exposed the stuff in their life. So they might come into treatment and say, all my problems began when my big T trauma hit. And I go, Yes, but I think there were cracks in the foundation that the big T trauma exposed. And that's the reason why you didn't handle the big T trauma as well as you could have and ended up where you are today. So let me just give you this as an aside. One of the things that we do at React and Lift, and you can find out about them on our website, but those are our programs for dealing with trauma, complex PTSD. One of the things we spend a lot of time doing is helping people evaluate their childhood, not just for trauma, but for any unhealthy tools that they were given. So they might have had a family that was quite healthy, but they were given a couple unhealthy tools. And so if you're at a point in life and you're saying, maybe I should check out my life to see if there's cracks in the foundation, to see if I was handed some tools that maybe aren't healthy, I would encourage you to check out Lift or React so that you can do a very careful inventory of your life. Not to blame your parents, not to say it was all bad, but to see the things that you were given that weren't healthy, that could set you up to fail if a big T trauma hits. And I think you would find a ton of value from doing those programs. So let me go to then the sequence of healing. And I'm going to do more work on this in the future in teaching, but let me give you this today. So yes, you begin with the PTSD stuff in the brain stem, in the limbic brain. That has to heal first before you can get to all the other stuff. So before a person can heal, they have to be in safety. But in order to be in safety, that means they have to be able to trust some people. You can't heal without a little bit of trust. And you can't have trust unless you have some safe people. But also with that, that means you also need to be able to connect in real ways with some safe people. And so the beginning of healing happens with safety, trust, and connection. That is so important. Then the next thing that we want people to gain as a tool is self-compassion. Instead of saying, I've blown my life, terrible me, beat myself up, I go, I was just trying to survive as a little kid. I wasn't trying to destroy my life or anybody else's. So I'm going to be compassionate to my little child, that little child. I am not going to try and beat myself up today because I created a faulty program trying to survive. I'm going to have compassion on myself. That is so important. Then the next thing is I need a surrogate family. I need a healthy support network. I can't do this work alone. I can't learn new ways of living alone. I can't learn to regulate myself alone. I need people around me, relationships and support. So you begin to build that. And then you learn how to regulate yourself if you're triggered, how to de-escalate your limbic brain. And so you get grounding skills, and those are all part of the beginning of the healing journey. That's the dealing with the trauma, PTSD part of that. And then you go to the beginning to reprocess the memories, understanding what happened, finding healing, finding how they affected you. Okay? Then now you enter the complex PTSD part of the healing. Now you begin to look at all the self-awareness stuff, understanding all your faulty programming, all the patterns, all your ways of coping that are maladaptive, all the lies that you have believed. Then you begin learning healthy truth, healthy tools, what healthy looks like. And you begin to implement those tools. But it's like learning to walk or ride a bike. You don't do it perfectly the first time. It takes practice. It takes failure. You learn from the failure and you keep going. And so that becomes the journey of healing. Now that might seem overwhelming to you. But if you are willing to enter into that kind of journey, it might feel overwhelming at the beginning, but you're going to start to see healing happen, change happen, growth happen. And that's going to lead to greater joy, greater benefits, greater results in your life. It's not going to lead to the old negative consequences that have been so much part of your existence. So I really encourage you, if you're wanting help, either for PTSD or if you realize you have complex PTSD, reach out and get it. It is so worth the effort and the work. It is so rewarding if you commit yourself to do it. Okay, that's the end of part 1. We're going to take a short break, and then I'm going to come back and do part 2, which is a Christian part. Again, if you're not interested in that, that's fine. No, we're not offended. You're free to go. We'll see you next week. For everybody else, we'll be back in just a minute. Okay, welcome back. We are looking at this guy in the Bible by the name of Joseph, and I hope you're finding his life to be very helpful. Of all the characters of the Bible, he's probably the one we're given the most detail about traumatic events that happened to him. And so far we've seen that he was bullied at home by his 10 older brothers who hated him. That was an awful thing. Then his brothers sold him and he became a slave in a foreign country in Egypt, and that was super traumatic. Then he was taken in as a slave by Potiphar, but Potiphar's wife, she falsely accused him of trying to rape her, and so he didn't have a fair trial, nothing. He was thrown into prison, another traumatic event. And that's where we've left him. And for Joseph at that point, it would look like basically he was going to die in prison. He was never going to get a fair trial. Nobody cared about a slave. And Potiphar was one of the most powerful men in Egypt, and he didn't have to abide by fair laws for slaves. So Joseph's life looked pretty bleak. His future looked pretty bleak. But what we're going to have today is 2 things are going to happen that are going to make it look like things are looking up. But then they're all going to come crashing down again. And so what we were going to see with Joseph, we saw it with Potiphar. Things started looking up. Then he's accused of rape. Everything crashes. Today, things are going to start to look up. Then they're all going to crash. And he's going to go through another horrific trauma event. So let me read. It says, "So Potiphar took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held. And there he remained." And we're not told exactly just how long he was there, but it's going to end up being a number of years he was there. But then it says this, "But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love." And we're not 100% sure what that means. We're going to see that meant that God made some good stuff happen for Joseph in prison. But it would also give the sense that Joseph in prison kind of had a sense that God was there. He felt this emotional connection to God and God's love. It would seem to be that that's included there. And then it says, "And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden." So of all the prisoners, the warden liked Joseph best. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything, and the Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. sounds just like Potiphar's house. Everything Joseph did worked out perfectly. And Potiphar went to being this super successful person who had even greater riches and fewer problems thanks to Joseph. And now in prison, the warden starts giving Joseph more responsibilities. And everything Joseph touches succeeds. And the warden has never had the prison run so smoothly, has never had so few problems in the prison. Joseph is the greatest thing that happened to that prison. It's looking great. And then we read this. Sometime later, so Joseph's been in prison, kind of running the show, basically, for a number of years. Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master, which is Pharaoh. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials and put them in prison where Joseph was. So let me say this. The cupbearer and the baker, those were the two people that handled Pharaoh's food. And so every king feared assassination. And one way to kill a king was to poison his drink or his food. And so what the king would do was pick two of his closest friends who he trusted more than anybody else to be his cupbearer who sampled his drink and his baker who tasted all of his food. So if there was poison, guess who died? Not Pharaoh, but one of his two friends would die, either if they poisoned the drink or poisoned the food. So what you have is Joseph has come in contact with Potiphar, his bodyguard, his trusted friend, and now the cupbearer and the baker, Pharaoh's other two trusted friends. So the three most trusted people in Pharaoh's life, Joseph has now come in contact with. So now the cupbearer and the baker are sent to prison. So what it means is there's been an assassination attempt. Somebody has tried to poison Pharaoh, and it got past the cupbearer or the baker, and Pharaoh became sick. So Pharaoh knows, okay, either the cupbearer or the baker is trying to kill me. They let the poison pass. So he puts both of them in prison until he can figure out which one is guilty of trying to kill him. So that's why they are in prison. So they remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. So Joseph now has these two special prisoners. And so we're told that while they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream on the same night. And each dream had its own meaning. And when Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked troubled. So he didn't know they were having dreams. All he sees is they're both very troubled. And he says, "Why do you look so worried today? What's wrong with you guys?" And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean. We both know there's a meaning here, but nobody can tell us what they mean. That's why we're troubled." Now notice Joseph's response. He says, "Interpreting dreams is God's business. Go ahead and tell me your dreams." Do you want to know what I would have said if I had these two people say, "We both had a dream and we think there's a meaning"? I would have said, "Don't ask God for the meaning of dreams." Because I had a dream once, and I thought God gave me the meaning that I would become this great person and my brothers would bow down to me. Don't ask God about dreams. Dreams, no, I don't want anything to do with dreams. Dreams are part of my trauma, my bad memories. But what does Joseph say? He says, "Do not interpretation of dreams belong to God? Tell me your dream." What does that mean? That Joseph still believes that the dreams God gave him as a boy have meaning, that God is still going to carry them out. He still believes that God gave him the dream and the interpretation of the dream. So even though he's in prison in what looks to be a hopeless future where he'll die in prison, he says, God gives dreams. God will give the meaning of the dream. Tell me your dreams, because God will give me the interpretation for your dreams. That to me is absolutely mind-boggling. Here is Joseph, years after he had a dream, years after nothing but bad has happened to him, and he still believes God. Even though circumstances say things are hopeless, your dreams will never happen, he believes the God that gave me the dreams I'm believing is still going to make them happen. That is absolutely mind-boggling. Now, here's what happens. Joseph tells them their dreams, and their dreams happen. His interpretation happens just as Joseph says it will happen. He tells the baker, you're the guilty one. Cupbearer, you're going to be restored to your job. Baker, you're going to get killed. And that's what happens. And then as the cupbearer is released, Joseph says to him, tell Pharaoh that I'm in prison under false accusations. And the cupbearer promises him, I'll tell Pharaoh and you'll get out right away, because Pharaoh now trusts me again. And the cupbearer gets out of jail and forgets all about Joseph. And his hopes are dashed again. It doesn't look like anybody is going to take his message of injustice to Pharaoh. But Joseph is still trusting God. Absolutely mind-boggling. The faith he had, the connection to God that he was hanging on to even in his darkest hours. I just hope that encourages you. Let's pray. Father, again, we're just amazed by this young man that had so many bad, negative things happen, but still knew that what you told him years earlier was true, and he was still hanging on to your promise. Even though the promises of men were being broken on a regular basis, he knew you would never break your promise. And so I just pray you would help each of us to trust you in our dark times. Amen. Well, that's the end of our Friday night. Thanks so much.